did you get it?
Mombasa! Get in!
Robert Redford is one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood history, the star of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, and the visionary behind the Sundance Film Festival. To the world, he's a legend of the screen and a champion of independent cinema. But here's the contradiction. While audiences saw him as a larger-than-life actor and director, at home he was simply a husband and a father. Redford had 4 children, some who followed creative paths and others who faced tragedy. So, whatever happened to Robert Redford's kids? Charles Robert Redford Jr. was born on August 18, 1936, in Santa Monica, California. His father worked as an accountant, and his mother was a homemaker. Though the family lived modestly, they nurtured Robert's curiosity, creativity, and athleticism. As a teenager, Redford often described himself as restless and rebellious. He admitted later in life that he was a bad student who struggled with discipline and direction. After graduating from high school, he enrolled at the University of Colorado, but he dropped out after only a year. It was a turbulent period in his life, marked by youthful drinking and, most devastatingly, the death of his mother when he was just 18 years old. That loss left a permanent scar. Redford later reflected, "Losing my mother so young was devastating. It changed me forever and gave me a sense of urgency about life." Searching for purpose, he traveled abroad in the mid-1950s, studying painting in Paris and living for a time as a struggling artist in Europe. Though he loved art, he realized he lacked the patience and discipline to make it a career. Returning to the United States, he moved to New York City and enrolled in the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. It was there that he discovered acting, a passion that combined his creativity with performance. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Redford was landing small television and stage roles, slowly building his craft. His Broadway breakthrough came in 1963 with Barefoot in the Park, where he played the charming but exasperated husband opposite Elizabeth Ashley. Audiences loved his charisma and natural presence. Hollywood took notice, and soon he was being offered film roles. His early film career included projects like Inside Daisy Clover with Natalie Wood and the screen adaptation of Barefoot in the Park. These roles helped establish him as a rising star, but it was in 1969 that his life changed forever. Cast alongside Paul Newman and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Redford became an international superstar. His role as the Sundance Kid not only gave him a lifelong nickname, but also cemented his place in movie history. And if you are into classic Hollywood icons, amazing stories, and newly discovered insights, then hit that subscribe button. We are on our way to 10,000 subscribers, and your support will mean a lot to our channel. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Redford's career soared. He starred in The Sting, reunited with Paul Newman in another classic caper, in All the President's Men, where he played journalist Bob Woodward during the Watergate scandal, and in Out of Africa, the sweeping romantic epic with Meryl Streep. His combination of good looks, intelligence, and quiet intensity made him both a Hollywood heartthrob and a respected actor. Not content to stay in front of the camera, Redford began moving into directing. His debut as a director, Ordinary People in 1980, won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director for Redford himself. It proved that his talents went far beyond acting, but while the world was celebrating Robert Redford as a movie star and an acclaimed director, at home he was taking on another role that defined him just as deeply, that of a husband and father. Asterisk. While Robert Redford's professional career was just beginning in the late 1950s, his personal life was already moving in a serious direction. In 1958, he married Lola Van Wagenen, a bright and curious history student from Provo, Utah. They had met by chance outside a Los Angeles laundromat when Robert was just 21. Despite their very different upbringings, Redford was a California kid chasing art and acting, and Lola came from a conservative Mormon family. Their connection was instant. The young couple married quietly in Las Vegas. Later in life, Lola would reflect that their union was built on a sense of adventure and mutual curiosity. Redford admitted that in those days he was still trying to find himself, but Lola provided grounding and stability at a time when his life was uncertain. Their early years together were marked by both love and tragedy. Their first child, Scott Anthony Redford, was born in 1959, but heartbreak came quickly. Baby Scott died just 5 months later from sudden infant death syndrome. Robert rarely spoke about the loss, but when he did, his words were haunting. You don't ever get over it. It stays with you, and it shapes you in ways you can't even explain. That early grief deeply influenced how he approached fatherhood with his later children. Determined to build a family, Robert and Lola welcomed their daughter Shauna Jean Redford in 1960. Shauna grew up to be a talented painter, carving her own quiet path in the arts while avoiding Hollywood's glare. 2 years later, in 1962, their second son, David James Jamie Redford, was born. Jamie was deeply creative like his father, but instead of acting, he pursued storytelling through documentaries and dedicated his life to activism, particularly in environmental and health causes. Their youngest, Amy Hart Redford, was born in 1970. Growing up in a home steeped in creativity and surrounded by her father's legacy, she would eventually follow Robert into the world of film as both an actress and a director. For Robert and Lola, family life was anything but traditional. With Redford's rising fame in Hollywood, there was constant media attention, but Robert was determined to give his children as normal a childhood as possible. Instead of raising them solely in Los Angeles, he purchased land in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah. There, the Redford family built a life close to nature, skiing in the winters, hiking in the summers, and living far from the glare of paparazzi. Even as his career took off with films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting, Redford remained protective of his family's privacy. He often said that Hollywood's glitz was not real life, and that his real identity was shaped by being a husband and father. The marriage between Robert and Lola lasted nearly 3 decades before ending in divorce in 1985. By that time, their children were grown, and both Robert and Lola had pursued independent paths. Lola continued her work as an activist and historian, while Robert carried the scars of both his early loss and the pressures of balancing fame with fatherhood. Reflecting on those years, Redford once admitted, "When you've lost a child, when you've watched your kids go through struggles, it strips away the illusion of Hollywood. Awards and fame don't matter. What matters is family and the people you love." Though their marriage ended, the family bonds endured. Each of Robert's children would carry forward pieces of his creative spirit and also the weight of tragedy that marked the Redford family's story from the very beginning. Asterisk. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Robert Redford had become one of the biggest stars in the world. Films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting turned him into an icon, admired for his looks, charisma, and talent. But while Hollywood celebrated him, Redford himself remained deeply suspicious of fame. He once remarked, "Hollywood gives you everything and nothing at the same time. It's illusion. Family is what's real." That belief shaped the way he raised his children. Instead of keeping them in Los Angeles, he created a very different kind of upbringing in Utah. Redford had purchased land in the Wasatch Mountains, which at first was meant to be a personal retreat. Over time, it became the family's main home, a place where the children could grow up surrounded by nature, far from the glare of paparazzi and red carpets. Life at the Redford home in Utah was a world away from Hollywood glamour. The kids skied in the winters, hiked and camped in the summers, and grew up with the mountains as their playground. Robert believed strongly in the power of the outdoors to shape character. He once explained, "Nature teaches discipline, humility, and resilience. That's what I wanted my children to learn, not the false promises of Hollywood." Family friends described Redford as protective, sometimes even strict. He insisted on family dinners and made sure his children valued education and independence. He didn't like them being dragged into the Hollywood spotlight. Very rarely did he bring them to premieres or film sets. At home, he wasn't Robert Redford, the movie star. He was Dad. Still, fame was inescapable. The Redford children knew their father was admired around the world. They saw reporters at the gates, and they felt the weight of carrying a famous last name. Later in life, each admitted that being Robert Redford's child was both a blessing and a burden. It gave them opportunities, but it also came with expectations they never asked for. Shauna remembered that growing up at Sundance gave her a sense of peace and privacy that most Hollywood children never had. Jamie credited the environment for shaping his passion for environmental causes, saying that being surrounded by wild landscapes instilled in him a responsibility to protect them. Amy, the youngest, often said she loved the creativity that seemed to flow naturally around her, from her father's films to the Sundance community that was beginning to form in their backyard. It was in this family environment that the seeds of the Sundance Institute were planted. What began as Redford's private retreat slowly evolved into a space for independent artists to gather, experiment, and create. The Redford kids were witnesses to this transformation, watching their father not just act and direct, but build a cultural movement. For Robert Redford, family life in Utah wasn't about hiding from fame, but about balancing it. By day, he could be on the set of a blockbuster. By night, he was back home, splitting firewood, helping his children with homework, or tucking them into bed. The contrast was stark, but it was deliberate. Redford wanted his children to know that Hollywood was temporary, but family and integrity were permanent. Reflecting years later, Redford said, "I've lived two lives, the public one, with the lights and the cameras, and the private one, with my family in the mountains. Of the two, the private life has always been the most important." Robert and Lola's eldest surviving child, Shauna Jean Redford, was born in 1960, just a year after the heartbreak of losing their first son, Scott. For Robert and Lola, Shauna's arrival was a blessing, a reminder of new beginnings after unimaginable loss. Growing up as the daughter of one of the world's most famous actors wasn't always easy, but Shauna's childhood was marked less by Hollywood parties and more by the quiet rhythms of Utah life. While her father was on film sets, she was surrounded by the forests and mountains of Sundance, a landscape that would later shape her worldview and her art. Shauna discovered her passion for painting at a young age. Instead of following her father into acting, she chose visual art as her form of expression. Over the years, she developed a reputation as a thoughtful and talented painter, producing abstract works that reflected both her emotional depth and her connection to nature. Those close to her have described her art as soulful, deeply personal, and often inspired by the landscape she grew up in. Despite carrying one of the most recognizable last names in Hollywood, Shauna has always shied away from the spotlight. She values privacy, focusing on her family and her creative pursuits rather than public attention. Robert himself admired this quality in her, once saying, "I never wanted my kids to feel pressured to follow my path." I'm proud of Shauna for finding her own voice in her own way. In 1985, Shauna married journalist and writer Eric Schlosser. Schlosser would go on to become famous for his 2001 book, Fast Food Nation, a groundbreaking exposé on the fast food industry that became a bestseller and cultural milestone. Together, Shauna and Eric built a partnership based on creativity, intellect, and shared values. Unlike the Hollywood couples her father was surrounded by, their marriage was rooted in privacy and a quiet commitment to family. Shauna and Eric have two children, making Robert Redford a grandfather once again. For Redford, who has experienced both the joy of children and the heartbreak of loss, his grandchildren have been a source of deep happiness. Friends of the family have said that Robert lights up whenever he talks about them, describing them as part of the legacy that matters most to him. Today, Shauna continues to paint and live a life far removed from Hollywood. She and Eric have remained largely private, preferring the company of family, friends, and the intellectual and creative worlds they thrive in. While she has not sought fame, her life and work represent another form of legacy, one of quiet artistry, integrity, and devotion to family. Though Robert Redford is remembered around the world for his roles and his impact on film, Shauna's story reminds us that not every legacy is measured in awards or headlines. Sometimes it is found in the choice to live authentically, to create quietly, and to raise the next generation with love and resilience. Asterisk. Robert and Lola's second son, David James Redford, known to everyone as Jamie, was born in 1962. From the very beginning, Jamie had a different energy from his siblings, curious, thoughtful, and deeply empathetic. He inherited his father's creativity, but expressed it not through acting, but through writing, filmmaking, and activism. Jamie attended the University of Colorado and later earned a master's degree in literature from Northwestern University. His passion for storytelling led him into screenwriting and eventually into documentary filmmaking, where he found his calling. But his path was not without hardship. In his 20s, Jamie was diagnosed with a rare liver disease, primary sclerosing cholangitis. The condition would haunt him for decades. He underwent not one, but 2 liver transplants in the 1990s. After surviving those ordeals, Jamie decided to dedicate his life to causes bigger than himself. He once said, "When you've been given a second chance, you don't waste it. You do something that matters." In 1995, he co-founded the James Redford Institute for Transplant Awareness, using film and storytelling to educate people about organ donation. Later, he and his father founded the Redford Center, a non-profit dedicated to environmental documentaries and activism. Through films like The Big Picture, Rethinking Dyslexia and Resilience, The Biology of Stress, and The Science of Hope, Jamie highlighted issues affecting children, families, and the planet. His work was acclaimed for its compassion and clarity, often shining a light on problems overlooked by mainstream media. Despite his health battles, Jamie was known for his optimism and warmth. Friends described him as someone who radiated kindness. Robert himself was deeply proud of his son, once saying, "Jamie was the best of us. He had a big heart, and he used it to make the world better." Tragically, in October of 2020, Jamie passed away at the age of 58 after being diagnosed with bile duct cancer. His death devastated the Redford family. Robert released a statement honoring his son. "The pain is immeasurable." Jamie lived a beautiful, impactful life. He was a loving father, husband, and son, and he leaves behind a legacy of compassion and activism that will continue to inspire. Jamie's wife, Kyle, and their 2 children, Dylan and Lena, carry on his memory. Dylan has pursued a career in the arts, continuing the Redford family's creative tradition, while Lena has worked in education and advocacy. Jamie Redford may not have been a Hollywood star like his father, but his impact was profound. Through his films, his activism, and his family, he left behind a legacy rooted not in celebrity, but in service. His life embodied the values Robert Redford cherished most: integrity, compassion, and using creativity to make the world a better place. The youngest of Robert and Lola's children, Amy Hart Redford, was born in 1970. By the time she arrived, her father was already a global movie star. Yet Amy's childhood, like that of her siblings, was spent largely in Utah, surrounded by nature rather than the flash of Hollywood. Amy grew up watching her father's career but was never pressured to follow in his footsteps. Still, creativity ran in her blood. After studying at the University of Colorado and in San Francisco, she eventually pursued acting. She appeared in films and television throughout the 1990s and 2000s, including roles in This Revolution and The Understudy, as well as appearances on shows like Law and Order, Criminal Intent. But Amy was drawn not just to performing, but also to storytelling behind the camera. In 2008, she made her directorial debut with The Guitar, an independent film about a woman diagnosed with a terminal illness who decides to live out her wildest dreams. The film premiered at Sundance, the very festival her father had founded decades earlier, creating a symbolic moment of continuity between father and daughter. Over the years, Amy has built a career as an actress, director, and producer, often gravitating toward projects that explore resilience, creativity, and human spirit, themes that echo her family's values. While she never reached the same level of fame as her father, she has carved out her own space in the independent film world. Outside of her career, Amy is also a mother. She has a daughter named Eden, born in 2008, who has been the center of her world. For Robert Redford, Eden was another grandchild to cherish, a bright reminder of his legacy continuing into yet another generation. Amy has spoken in interviews about growing up as the daughter of Robert Redford. She acknowledged the challenges of carrying a famous name, but emphasized that her father encouraged independence. In one interview, she said, "My dad never pushed us into the business. He wanted us to find our own voices, whatever they might be. That's probably the greatest gift he gave me." Today, Amy continues to work in film and creative projects, balancing her professional ambitions with motherhood. She represents the most public of the Redford children, carrying on her father's passion for storytelling while shaping it in her own way. Through Amy, the Redford name continues in the arts, not as an echo of Robert's career, but as a new voice inspired by his legacy. For Robert Redford, life as a father and grandfather has been marked by both joy and heartbreak. The early loss of his first son, Scott, and the tragic death of his second son, Jamie, decades later, were wounds that never fully healed. Redford has often said that grief changes you, and those close to him note that it gave him both a deeper compassion and a relentless drive to make his work matter. Even while dealing with personal tragedy, Redford poured his energy into causes close to his heart. In the 1980s, he transformed his Utah property into the Sundance Institute, a space where independent filmmakers could experiment and thrive. What began as a small gathering blossomed into the Sundance Film Festival, now one of the most important platforms for independent cinema in the world. For Redford, it was more than a festival. It was his way of giving back, of creating opportunities for others to tell their stories. Redford also became a passionate environmentalist and philanthropist. He supported conservation efforts across the American West and used his fame to speak out about climate change and the preservation of natural landscapes. His children, especially Jamie, often credited him for instilling in them a sense of responsibility to protect the planet. By the 2000s and 2010s, Redford's career had spanned 6 decades, with acting, directing, and producing credits that made him one of Hollywood's most enduring icons. Yet he was never entirely comfortable with celebrity. He once remarked, "I don't like stardom. It's not who I am. I'd rather be in the mountains with my family." In 2018, Redford announced his retirement from acting after the release of The Old Man and the Gun. At 82 years old, he said it was time to step away from the screen and focus on family, art, and the causes that had always defined him beyond Hollywood. Despite the public image of confidence and control, those who knew him best say his later years were shaped most by family. He relished his role as a grandfather, often speaking about the joy of watching new generations grow. The pain of losing Scott and Jamie never disappeared, but his daughters, Shauna and Amy, along with his grandchildren, became his anchors. Robert Redford's later years reflect the arc of a man who was both a Hollywood legend and a private soul. He endured unimaginable loss, but used his grief to fuel creativity, activism, and generosity. He once summed it up simply, "Life is about loss, but it's also about what you do with it." For me, the answer has always been family, nature, and storytelling. Robert Redford's story was one of triumph and tragedy, of fame and family. He lost two of his children, Scott as an infant and Jamie as an adult, wounds that never fully healed. Yet those losses gave him perspective and a sense of urgency. He poured his energy into family, into the land he loved in Utah, and into building something greater than himself with the Sundance Institute and Film Festival. He became not just one of Hollywood's greatest actors and directors, but also a champion for independent filmmakers and a passionate environmentalist who used his voice to protect the natural world. His children, Shauna and Amy, and his grandchildren continue to carry forward those values. And now, the world says goodbye. On September 16th, 2025, Robert Redford passed away at the age of 89. Tributes are already pouring in for the star of The Sting, Butch Cassidy, and The Sundance Kid, and The Natural. Headlines call him a Hollywood icon, a visionary, and a giant of American cinema. But for his family, he was simply Dad and Grandpa, the man who chopped firewood in Utah, who insisted that family dinners mattered more than red carpets, and who believed that storytelling could change the world. Redford once summed up his philosophy of life with quiet simplicity. Life is about loss, but it's also about what you do with it. For me, the answer has always been family, nature, and storytelling. Today, his films remain, his festival endures, and his spirit lives on in his children and grandchildren. Robert Redford leaves behind a legacy that will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching. If you want to honor Redford's life and explore more stories about the families behind the legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And tell us in the comments, what do you think Robert Redford's greatest legacy will be? His unforgettable films or the family and causes he dedicated his life to?